Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. The explosion of social media, a global pandemic, and social unrest across the country has created a generation of civic activists on issues like racial justice, climate change, and much more. Yet, Gen Z's lived experience of democracy has been largely polarized and divided. Joining us now to discuss what it will take to restore trust and strengthen youth engagement in democracy are Reed Howard, Senior Director of Communications at Millennial Action Project.
Thank you.
Winter BreeAnne, Impact Strategist, Activist, and student at Howard University. And Rob Flaherty, Director of the White House Office of Digital Strategy. Thank you all so much for being here. Winter, I'd like to start with you. We're going to start with the basics, though. Gen Z has some very distinct political interests and desires. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those desires are from your own perspective and from what you've heard from others that you've connected with?
Yeah, for sure. Is this on? It's like so, I don't know. Anyways, Gen Z is really a generation of we, right? And I think what that means is because we're born in this digital age where we're connected to people who otherwise previous generations would have never been connected to based on where they live, locality, and that sort of thing. Gen Z, when we show up in our everyday lives, and particularly when we go to the voting block, what we're thinking about is not just ourselves. We're thinking about the greater community. And I think you see across generations that, especially in America, we have a very individualist culture where, everyone wants the best for them and their families, but oftentimes it's at the expense of others. And so I think when Gen Z shows up to the voting block, they're not just thinking about themselves, they're thinking about that person in Florida that may be dealing with flooding because of climate change, but they may live in Arizona. Or they're thinking of the young Black woman who was dealt with police violence, and that person who's thinking about the person may have never dealt with that before. And so I think because of the digital age and our interconnectedness, we care about a lot of social issues, practically every social issue. And I think the thing that makes us different is that we collectively care. And it's not just the people who face those issues themselves.
But it's interesting that you talk about how this translates at the voting booth because a lot of Gen Z hasn't been able to cast their first ballot just yet. But that's not stopping you from touring elementary schools and talking about civic participation and getting those young voters engaged. Do you find that there is a disconnect for young voters to understand just how important civic engagement is, or do they innately know that because of some of these things you're discussing?
I think there's two things. When it comes, so my first election I was ever voted in was in 2018. Before that, I could never vote. Actually, no, not 2018, 2020. I was 17 in 2018. But before that, I had been actively at the polls with my families, with my friends. I was that person who really helped them understand their ballot. But the thing that people don't often talk about is how inaccessible. Aren't introduced to the idea of civic engagement. And so, with a lot of my work before I was even of age to vote was really about galvanizing young people, starting at the age of 6, 7, 8, about what it means to hold the power of their voice, but then also translate that into civic action.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Rob, I want to go to you as well to talk about what the digital team has learned over these past few years when it comes to connecting with these young voters, getting them engaged, getting them educated on some of the things that are going to be impacting them as they go to cast that ballot.
Sure, of course. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, great. Okay, great. I have the karaoke mic, so I'm. I would love the Britney Spears mic, though. I think the White House has always had a space for communicating with people. Literally, the White House, the West Wing, is constructed around the idea that we use the media to talk to people. There's a room for it, right? People shout questions at a press secretary and whatever. But the idea of communicating directly to people via reporters, we know that's kind of a dated model now, both for two reasons. One, because the White House now can communicate directly with people through our social media channels, through the president's voice, and all of these things. But the other thing is that the aperture for who people get information from, in particular young people, is a lot wider now. Reporters and media are a great way to talk to people who care about the news, right? Cat Fancy Magazine is a great way to talk to people who like cats. But we have to talk to a lot of people who live beyond like the daily news cycle, and a lot of young people are following it really closely, and a lot aren't. And so that means a YouTuber is going to have just as much salience to folks as Jake Tapper, right? And so it means that we need to actually dedicate resources to going out and talking to folks in the places where they are. And so we are the first White House to actually have dedicated staff for social media content creators who we're engaging with on a regular basis, both through briefings, which we did around the war in Ukraine, which ended up being an SNL cold open, which we wear as a badge of honor, but through individual engagements with the president. He was in Detroit with Daniel Mack, who's a prominent TikToker. On the day we signed, or the day we were celebrating the Inflation Reduction Act, we had about 20 prominent TikTokers. I think Khalil is going to do this at some point. He was one of them. I think the reality is it just means young people get information from a lot of different places, and so we need to be there. And so that's the imperative.
But some of those places are not traditional places, as you mentioned. We have TikTok, which I know my mom, who I hope is watching out there somewhere, does not know what TikTok is, would be very confused why I would be getting news off of TikTok. Yeah. How do you communicate with somebody from an older generation who would say, why aren't you communicating with us in a different way? Or how is this actually helping our young people stay informed?
Well, there's two things. One, accepting the premise. 1/3 of young people in a Pew study recently said they go to TikTok in breaking news moments for search, right? People are using TikTok just the same way they are Google, the same way they're using YouTube. And so when news is breaking, people are going there, and we need to communicate with folks in the places where they are in those moments. But the other thing is, this is not just a Gen Z behavior. And in fact, Gen Z's behavior is sort of a leading indicator for the way that older generations are behaving. For a really long time, the hottest growth sector on Facebook was 65 plus. And so just because it's Gen Z who are leading the way and using the tools doesn't mean they're the only ones there. And so certainly when we do an engagement with Olivia Rodrigo, that's reaching a certain amount of people. When we do something with the Shade Room, that's reaching a different audience. And when we do Instagram Live with the AARP, that's reaching a different audience too. And so we have to we have to lead with our audiences first, and then kind of work out who they're sort of engaging with from there.
Rita, I want to bounce this off of you a little bit. So once those engagement activities reach the people that they're supposed to reach, they get them to the polls as they're supposed to be, and then we see young leaders elected like Maxwell Frost, I know was brought up in the previous panel. You yourself were elected to DC when you were just 19 years old. You now work with Millennial and Gen Z elected officials through your MAP program. Talk a little bit about how you see young leaders govern differently than older, for lack of a better word, leaders.
Yeah, so when young people show up in halls of power, they really do govern differently than some of their older counterparts. So what my organization does is connect, engage, and mobilize a new generation of leadership. We're not just focused on election day, but what happens in the 700 plus days in between those governing days. And the way that we see all of the pandemics, the wars, the economic crises have impacted Gen Z and millennials is showing up in a way that they're much more pragmatic about who they work with to get stuff done. And that might surprise a lot of people, but in state houses across the country, out of all of the legislators, only 21% are under the age of 45, but 32% of the bipartisan bills that were not only authored but passed were written by members of Gen Z and millennials. And so they're scoring really high on these indexes of bipartisanship because they want to get things done to make their communities better. And they're part of the most diverse generation in history. Gen Z, is full of people across spectrums of ideology, of race, of religion, and they're wanting to work with people who are unlike them to get things done for their generation. Yeah.
That's powerful, too, to see that bipartisanship as you talk about it. I know there was a MAP report that said 334 Millennial and Gen Z candidates ran this election cycle. Is there a reason that we're seeing this sudden surge in young folks wanting to not just be part of the political system in terms of voting, but to be part of making that legislation, to having those bipartisan conversations?
Yeah, I think so. I think young people are seeing that there's a ton of problems, and instead of running away from them, they have to run towards them. And they're committed to doing what needs to be done and to solve the issues that are impacting their local communities. And if that means through elected office, they're going to pursue that route. And so there's 27 members of Gen Z who are in state houses across the country. There's more that are joining them after this most recent election. There's one member of Gen Z that's coming to Congress, like you said, and we're really excited to see the ways that they work across the aisle, build these creative coalitions in order to get things done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Winner, I want to ask you very quickly, maybe not so quickly, it's a heavy question. Are we ready for this? Identity is such an important part for so many people when it comes to casting our ballot. And we're both two young Black women up on this stage. We have many Black folks in our audience tonight and hopefully listening at home as well. You told 17 magazine that a major part of your activism is to work toward liberation for all people, particularly Black people. You said once Black people are free, everyone is free. So I want to turn that question that you asked in 17 back to yourself, which is, how do you see Gen Z further the movement for Black liberation and for Black folks to be able to take that liberation forward to these political institutions?
Yeah, I would also like to say, which may be contrary to the beliefs of this room, I don't believe that electoral politics is what's going to get us to liberation. I think it's a tool in the toolbox, but I do not think that it's a die-alone solution, and I don't think the solution solely lies in politics at all. But you've also seen, historically, the political landscape has often pushed against liberation of Black people because it makes money, and so because of that, I think when I'm talking to Black people, I'm talking to people across the country and Gen Z in general, we understand that voting and being engaged civically is a power move. We can't play only against the system, we have to play within the system as well. And I think it's definitely a huge tool in the toolbox, the idea of voting and making our voices heard in that manner, just as big as it is to be in protest. And so with that being said, previously, I think young people across the board care about more people other than just themselves. And so I think we see record numbers of when you go to Black Lives Matter march, it's not just Black people, you know what I mean? Whereas previously, oftentimes Black people were some of the only people showing up and fighting for their liberation. And so that's really amazing to see, and it's really exciting to see. And so that also does translate, I feel at the voting box as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Rob, how is the digital team working to ensure that diverse and younger communities feel represented in the content that you are seeking and putting out?
It's a great question.
Oh, am I on? There I am. No, that's a great question. It's the most important question. The way that sort of the internet is moving towards is everybody's version of the internet is hyper-personalized now. People expect content that is given to them, that feels natural to them. The BS-ometer for young people is much higher. The reality is, in an environment where content is so personalized, you need to have content creators who are diverse to be able to produce content that feels resonant to people. It's not just a moral, it's important to do, but you cannot function as a person producing content, as a team producing content, if the audiences you need to talk to do not feel reflected in the stuff that you're producing. And you get that by hiring people who have different experiences in their content and different lived experiences too. And so it is one of the biggest priorities of the Biden administration, certainly to hire a diverse team, but it is mission critical for the president's political digital team back in the campaign. It was mission critical for the team that we built at the White House, and I think there's sort of no question that it's the most important thing you can do as a person who leads a content creation shop.
Reed, I want to ask you as well, very interesting to me is because the work that you do, where you're able to talk with so many leaders who are our age, maybe a little bit older than me and Winter right here, what are you hearing from these leaders on what they want the future to look like, and what are they doing to reach that future, to make those goals come to fruition?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really clear is young people are not interested in the culture war. They want to bring down some of this rhetoric because they see how much communities are being radicalized and hurt by some of the rhetoric coming out of our political class. They also want to change what it means and what it looks like to be a politician. They're often, focusing their resources on constituent services and community organizing when they're in office. And they're trying to find unique and novel ways to connect with the community so that they can constantly hear their voice and uplift them and bring them along in the legislative process. And so when you're changing that narrative about who's allowed to be in politics, about who are in the halls of power, you can build a healthier democracy where people see themselves reflected in their elected officials and the intentions of their elected officials. And hopefully that means that we're going to have more equitable halls of power so that we're passing legislation that changes people's lives.
Yeah. I want to go ahead and turn it over to the audience, see if we have any audience questions for our panelists up here.
Okay, my question's for Mr. Flaherty, but it's kind of relevant to your last point that you were making just there. When it comes to the culture war issues which turn off, Generation Z, a number of those things are the kind of things which, swing voters and moderates in swing districts do care about. And so a lot of the things which, you'd be presenting to Gen Z, aiming at a specific audience, none of that occurs in a silo. So what's the cost-benefit analysis from like a White House digital strategy point to weigh up, okay, well, this is really going to work for Gen Z, but people on the outskirts of Pittsburgh will hate it. Like, how do you kind of make that work out those trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, from a pure political perspective, if you look at what just happened a couple of weeks ago, right? We were successful as a party because we talked about the rights that people were going to lose, the things that people were going to lose under under MAGA Republicans too. So, I don't think it's about culture wars or not culture wars. It's about a conversation about, the kind of extremism and divisiveness that Republicans were making part of their agenda. So, I think we ran on a pretty, or we sort of articulated a pretty unified message. And that had salience with young people, certainly. It had salience with independents. And so I think the things are, you can try to over-target your message, but at the end of the day, it's important to have sort of one consistent overarching narrative. Certainly, there were things like student loans and marijuana policy that we talked about at down the stretch that had increased salience with young people. But those were things that were popular across the board, whether it was with young people or older folks. So I don't think there's a distinction to the way we think about issues when it comes to younger people versus older or swing districts or anything like that. I think we found a message that was resonant generally across the board, and I think that's why Democrats were so successful last week.
Do you think Generation Z and youth voters in particular will lose interest, especially if White House candidates fail to deliver on promises like student loans that are currently being backtracked or abortion rights that is also currently being backtracked?
Well, one of the things that I would say, so I work for a nonpartisan organization, but we have a caucus in the Congress that's chaired by a Republican and a Democrat called the Congressional Future Caucus. And this is one of the most productive and bipartisan Congresses in recent history. They've passed overwhelming bills from the Inflation Reduction Act to the CHIPS Act that it made major investments in infrastructure, technology, education. And so we're seeing that there are a lot of results that are coming out of this Congress, and it's the responsibility of some perhaps legislators to message that more effectively to Gen Z, to let them know all the great things that are getting done. But there's real results that are coming out in a bipartisan way from not just the Democrats, but Republicans who are willing to work with them. And when you see how productive these legislators are actually being, the ways that they are really getting creative about the coalitions they build to deliver these results, that's a message that will inspire more young people to get to the polls. The fact of the matter is we were only able to get these wins that we did have because young people showed up. And so when you show up more, when you deliver more legislators who are willing to work across the aisle, like I mentioned, MAP did a study with the Lugar Center at Georgetown University that scaled, that measured how bipartisan members of Congress under the age of 45 are, and they scored to be 56% higher than the historical average. So they're working across the aisle, they're getting results, and that should be reason for young people to continue to show up at the polls, to return other young members of Congress and members of state houses who are gonna get those results.
And then, also to your point, I want to piggyback off what you're saying, I think there is a discussion about the responsibility of the political establishment to actually meet young people where they're at and care about the issues, not just when it's election cycle. Because every election cycle, especially since 2018, there is these messages that, maybe we really care about your education, like you mentioned, with the student loans, or we really care about racial justice, but then by the time elected officials are in office, we don't see as much action on those. And so I think a part of it is it's a two-lane street. If you want people to show up for you consistently, you need to show up for them consistently. And I think particularly with the Black community, with young people, we've kind of had allegiances to parties, even when they didn't in turn provide that same allegiance. And so I think it's going to be interesting actually to see how the next election cycle turns around, because we are expecting things to change, And I do think we're going to continue to show up to the polls because our lives are the ones that are at stake, really. But I do think it's also important to shift that conversation around not just how do we get young people to show up, but how do you actually show up for young people?
All right, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much to my panelists this evening.